All right, well, let's begin. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to those of you who have joined our mini webinar here in the School of Education today, here on January 11th, 2024. And we're going to be looking at the topic of college enrollment and retention, daunting task or opportunity. That's with a question mark there at the end. And so let me introduce our panelists today that will be joining me as I facilitate the conversation. First of all, Dr. Kimberley Williams, wave Kimberley. And Dr. Williams has 3 decades of experience in higher education and currently serves as the Associate Vice President for Student Success and Retention at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. In addition, Kimberley is a senior consultant for the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers and serves as the assistant director of ACRO's SEM endorsement program. Dr. Williams has a proven record of consistent enrollment success and is widely viewed as one of the top enrollment professionals in the country. Kimberley's background includes extensive experience in building targeted student outreach, student readiness, and support programs that have assisted her in enhancing student diversity, community engagement, and retention rates at several higher learning institutions. Kimberley is the author of the 2021 book, History of American Higher Education, A to Z, a primer for enrollment managers, and recently co-authored a chapter in National Association of College Admissions Counseling's 6th edition of the Fundamentals of College Admissions Counseling, specifically addressing the U.S. higher education landscape. Kimberley holds an EDD degree from Regent School of Education, and her dissertation research examined employment engagement and succession planning in the context of retaining enrollment middle managers in the American Big Quit era that occurred during and just after COVID. Thank you, Kimberley, for joining us today. Our next panelist is Christy Mathews. So Christy, give us a wave. Thank you. Christy Mathews has served in Christian higher education enrollment management, academic advising, and student services for 16 years. She is co-founder and dean of enrollment and student services at Hildegard College, a classical Christian startup in Costa Mesa, California, helping form the next generation of entrepreneurs. She also provides strategic enrollment management consulting services to higher education institutions and coaching entities. She is currently completing her dissertation for a PhD in higher education once again in Regent School of Education. Christy lives in Southern California with her husband, 4-year-old son, and their golden retriever. She enjoys outdoor adventures in her quote unquote free time, which, as we know from doctoral studies, is very limited. And she also serves as a deacon in her local church. So panelists, thank you. Let me come back and join you with the video here. And I also want to thank Ashley Roms, a staff member in the School of Education who's helping to kind of facilitate Zoom and is taking questions or whatever needs to happen here behind the scenes. And Ashley is also a doctoral student well on her way to completing her dissertation. So thanks to all 3 of you wonderful ladies. So let's begin. We have a few areas we want to address regarding enrollment and retention. And oh my, they are daunting tasks. And I think by the time we finish, I think we'll see there's some opportunities as well. So let's think about our first topic area. Many aspects of college attendance were impacted dramatically by the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. So, Christy and Kimberley, what changes occurred in higher education due to COVID's impact? So let's start with Kimberley. Dr. Williams,
Sure.
what are some thoughts?
Yeah, great. No, that's a great question. And thank you all for this opportunity. It's great to be here. I think there were certainly lots of things happen and during the pandemic, and certainly we are all now really, as we have pivoted out of the pandemic, are still really wrestling with really what will be some ongoing challenges. I think the learning loss that happened on the K through 12 side certainly has had an impact. There's been a bit of a residual on the higher education side, and so I think one of the changes that has occurred is certainly a lot more support services and some emphasis on providing more support to students, recognizing that the pandemic certainly was pretty traumatic. It was a traumatic event, and so students will come to us, both traditional age students and adult students, having gone through really, in some cases, some trauma. And so that has necessitated the need to really enhance support services that already existed. I think revisiting the kind of support that was being offered. And so at least that comes to mind for me. I don't know if Christy has some other thoughts, but certainly really we all did, I think, a pretty good job with that pivot. But now we have to have that ongoing support, recognizing that there will be some there'll be a residual impact for some time for students coming out of the pandemic, and really thinking about how can we support students in new ways, perhaps enhancing existing services, and in some cases adding new support services.
All right, good deal. Christy, what are your thoughts?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Pittman, and it really is a privilege to be here with you all today. I completely agree that it's both a daunting task and an opportunity, and we really see that as we look at pandemic response across higher education. On one hand, the pandemic caused significant distress for institutions and students and their families. And then on the other hand, we see that the pandemic really threw open the doors of opportunity and innovation for higher ed. So a couple examples that come to mind are, we saw a lot of colleges and universities make that sudden shift to online learning. And in some cases, that shift resulted in trouble with technologies, processes and such, and those negatively impacted student learning and perhaps student retention. But then on the other hand, higher ed realized, oh, we can make sudden shifts and we can make overnight change. And some of those changes resulted in enrollment increases for some institutions, as well as empowerment of staff, faculty, and students to thrive in more flexible environments. And then also we saw for some states with government shutdowns, mandates, that a lot of institutions lost their opportunity to interact with students and their families face-to-face. And so college fairs, conferences, campus visits, all of those things were off the table for a long time. Well, those same schools were able to innovate and take most of those events online, virtual, Zoom. And now institutions are finding that they can use both, just like we're doing today, to enhance their enrollment and retention. And then the last thing that comes to mind is the budget cuts and shifting resources. And we're still seeing that play out in higher ed. There are a lot of job losses. There are some whole institutions shutting down or merging with other institutions. But at the same time, those efforts have also streamlined processes and reduced unnecessary bureaucracies, and really helped some institutions focus on their differentiation and their mission.
Well, thank you all. Have made some marvelous points. And from a faculty perspective, that in 2020, that week or two shift that some colleges had to make, the shift from on campus to online, was a traumatic thing for traditional chalk and talk faculty. To move from in particularly smaller institutions that were on campus only, to make that shift to totally online that happened at most institutions was just a phenomenal change. COVID, as you all kind of pointed out, was a real struggle for institutions and certainly students as far as the learning curve. But I think it also created a massive change and a lot of burnout among faculty and staff at institutions. So that's certainly, and in fact, Kimberley, some of Kimberley's research on her dissertation talked about that a good bit. But and some of the support services, that really the first thing that comes to mind is the mental health issue. And as far as not that we've always had some mental health issues among the American population and even among college students, of course. But I think COVID just really enhanced that in really negative ways. In fact, some ways we're still seeing.
Dr. Pittman, if I could, as a quick follow-up to Ashley's comment, which I completely agree with 100%. I think the other thing that happened, another thing to note during the pandemic, was that testing policies of most institutions went to some form of a test blind policy, given what was happening and the ability for students to take their standardized test scores. And so in some cases, there was a pause in some institutions who had perhaps been reluctant to go test optional. They were forced to. And I do think that provided, coming out of the pandemic, an opportunity for some institutions to really think about their long-term policy as it relates to the SAT or ACT. Some have gone back to their policy before the pandemic, but many have decided to either continue to pilot a test optional policy, or at least in some cases decided to, move in a different direction and not require a test altogether. So it did force higher education to take a real close look at testing and whether or not they wanted to continue with their current policy, or would they be flexible to entertain a new testing policy relative to SAT and ACT.
Oh, that's a great point. And in fact, many institutions have maintained now and really, I think, really widely accepted the idea of open enrollment, which on one hand provides great access to higher education, but at the same time, it really speaks to issues of student preparation. Getting in and being successful are two different things. So, well, let's move to our second question. So, enrollment demographics have shifted in recent years and appear to be seeing a new demographic trend, particularly related to traditional college-age students. So let's begin with Christy. Would you discuss some of these trends as far as that 18 to 24-year-old traditional college student that we recognized in the past?
Absolutely. So I'll comment on this generally. There are two big things that stand out to me. One, all the institutions that I'm interacting with these days are bracing themselves for the upcoming demographic cliff in 2025, going into 2026. And many, not all, but most of these institutions are assuming that their traditional undergrad populations will decline no matter what their efforts. And one of the ways that they're preparing for these demographic shifts is by strengthening and increasing their programs and services to attract and retain adult and graduate audiences, and then also to expand their offerings with certificates and badges and such to undergrads to attract and retain them. And then secondly, Gen Z and their parents are much more skeptical of the value of the college investment these days. And so while most still correctly see a bachelor's degree as a good investment and as a positive pathway to good jobs and lifetime earnings, The current generations are less willing to acquire debt. They're less willing to spend 4+ years to obtain a degree, and they really expect to be job ready upon graduation. And so this, of course, places additional pressure on institutions to get creative, lower costs, increase transparency about their costs, and to increase pathways to degrees and certifications to really meet students where they are at.
Thank you. Dr. Kimberley.
Yeah, thanks. I echo Christy's comments, and I think that folks have certainly been aware of the demographic cliff now for some time, you know, recognizing that birth rates really dipped quite a bit during the 2008 recession. And so fast forward, you know, you have fewer students, you know, that are in the pipeline, if you will. I think the other thing as institutions really try to grapple with, you know, that there are fewer students because of those fewer births years ago, also recognizing that there are growths in certain populations of students. So for example, there's shifts in diversity. And so there is an increased number of Hispanic students, for example. However, their college going rates are not the same as perhaps other demographics. And so, you know, I think what this is requiring is that institutions really think about not only the big number, like how many students are in the pipeline, but what are the demographics and what kinds of things that we need to do perhaps differently to make sure that we are perhaps having correct appropriate outreach strategies for all the students that are going to be in the pipeline, recognizing that the pipeline is a little smaller these days. And I think it also is a reminder to we'll continue to have to watch the witchy data and to make sure that we are really being anticipatory, not only of what's to come in 2025, which is around the corner, but a little bit more of that long-term planning in terms of what are those birth rates look like, and how might that impact us in the next, say, 5 to 10 years. So it definitely was a reminder that you certainly, with enrollment and planning, you have to think really, really long-term and really think about what's on the horizon.
Well, and indeed, even though the number of traditional college students are dropping and will be lower for the next, 7, 8, 9 years at least, a report came out last May, I think, from the federal government that said there were 34 million individuals who had some college but no degree. And so, of course, typically, not necessarily, but many of those people are older. So they might be in their late 20s, 30s, or 40s. So there's a market there for higher education, people who need training, and it's just a matter of how higher ed adapts in order to support them. Let's move to our third question. So changes in instruction delivery from primarily on campus to, as you all have alluded to, increasingly online study has provided students many options and more options than ever for where and how they attend college. How do these changes impact college student retention? So, Kimberley.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I definitely think that the changes have impacted retention. I think in the context of thinking and strategy around what's happening in the classroom, whether that be really re-examining some pedagogy strategies, and then also so kind of the inside of the classroom, but also that onboarding piece, right? And so really thinking about that student journey from the time a student has kind of made the decision, they're going to enroll, you know, what, from a retention standpoint, you know, how can we ensure that onboarding is done in a way that kind of meets students where they are, perhaps is going to provide the time and place that they're looking for that's perhaps convenient to you, and really is going to resonate with this generation, kind of to Christy's point. So I think from a retention perspective, understanding that we need to be more and more flexible than we ever have in the past. Students expect that flexibility and they're looking for it. And if we are going to retain and graduate our students, really making sure that we've put things in place at every step of the way, from their very first, meeting with us at onboarding, to that in-classroom experience, to what's happening outside of the classroom, really building in that flexibility and recognizing that students, they have lots of choices. And we certainly have to make sure that we are kind of cognizant of the fact that we can't just do business. It's not a business as usual, right? And so we as institutions have to, be open to the change that that the students are demanding, that we, in some cases, make. And that can go from in any number of things, right? So I think that awareness and being responsive certainly will positively impact retention if institutions are really, really willing to be open and be understanding that this is what's required right now.
So being responsive, flexible, and I guess a good word is nimble in the traditional. Yeah, it's not business as usual. Christy, would you like to add anything?
Sure. And I absolutely echo that it is not business as usual. And I've had the privilege of interviewing female chief enrollment officers at CCCU institutions for my dissertation. And something that I'm hearing from them consistently is students hold the keys to the figurative kingdom these days. The institutions are much less in charge in this situation, and the students are really determining where institutions are going. And they've explained to me this tightrope that they're walking of staying true to their mission and vision, while also effectively meeting the needs and really demands of today's students. And for most institutions, the online market is saturated, and early adopters have the largest portion of the market share. And students know that if they don't have a good experience at one institution, that they can very easily leave and go to another one and probably thrive there. So retention is more challenging than ever. Institutions are scrambling to keep students engaged and progressing. And there are positives and negatives here again. On the negative side, I highly recommend following Gary Stalker from the College Viability app. He has some really interesting research into today's institutions and how they're performing on a numbers basis. And he's highlighted the unfortunate graduation rates of many small, especially private and religiously affiliated institutions. And these struggles with student retention are really showing up in those graduation rates. So the status quo cannot be maintained. We do need to be nimble. But then on a positive note, the online delivery option, while it affords many opportunities and shifts, it also gives those of us who are adult students in undergrad and graduate programs the opportunity to finish degrees we would have no hope of doing so otherwise. And I'm an example of that.
Excellent. Well, this whole issue of retention is increasingly a challenge. And of course, as is, we kind of discussed already a bit, retention. I think about Regent. When Regent started in the late 1970s, everything was on campus, and typically students, of course, moved to Virginia Beach or the nearby area with their families to go to school, and they were committed. And now a lot of the attitudes are, I can do this online, and if I take one course and don't like it, I'll go someplace else. So it's that part is there are lots of opportunities for students, but at the same time, institutions need to take the perspective that this is not about taking and passing one course. It's about what Regent School of Education talks about with doctoral students. It's a journey. And even for those in bachelor's or master's degrees, it really is, the goal is to earn a degree or a credential, not just to pass a course. And so helping students to recognize that and equipping them with a lot of the things that perhaps they're not getting in K-12 is critical for institutions to do, which means lots of work and lots of thought. So, all right, so let's move to another question here, specifically about recruitment. And let's think about, Christy, the strategies that colleges and universities can use to help optimize student recruitment in light of all the things we've talked about.
There is so much to comment on here, and for the sake of time, I'll just give a few bullet point ideas. One, partnerships with businesses, churches, even in institutions, affiliated denomination, local governments, the community. That will help both strengthen the institution's reputation in the community and also help the institution serve those students more effectively from inquiry to their alumni journey. Secondly, something that's come up a lot in my dissertation interviews is an all hands on deck approach to enrollment. Really, every single person affiliated with an institution is responsible in some way or another for enrollment. And research is showing that especially faculty involvement, again, from inquiry all the way to after graduation, is particularly important for enrollment success. And then lastly, what comes to mind is streamlining processes, making it as easy as possible for students, whether they're traditional or online, undergraduate or graduate, really removing the red tape as much as possible and giving students an opportunity to thrive and to really enjoy a positive relationship with the institution.
Good deal. Thank you. Kimberley.
I agree with everything. I will only add one thing again for the sake of time. I think in the context of all of the various tactics, I think trying to implement a strategic enrollment plan if one does not exist, right? Because I think, you know, to work smarter, not harder is a strategy in and of itself. And I think to be strategic, both with resources and then really also being pretty strategic in terms of what are the goals, what are the strategies, what are the tactics, how are we going to measure them to really make sure that the work that we're doing is measured and that it's effective and it's really getting the results that we want.
Excellent. Well, I want to talk a bit more about strategy here as we conclude our webinar here, but let's move on a little bit more into retention. So you all have mentioned there's been a significant transition of American higher ed in recent years, and certainly COVID has been part of that, and increasing online instruction. So what strategies can we think about or can we suggest to those viewing this to enhance that retention piece? Now, and some of this we've talked about,
Sure.
but Kimberly, I'll let you start and then I'll try to wrap this up.
Yes, I will. And I will respond in the context of the question that's been asked in the chat regarding our first generation students. And so I think from a retention standpoint, both for first gen students, really all students, I think really looking at your institution's financial aid policy, right? And so to what extent is the institution really thinking about their aid strategy, both from offering need-based awards and merit-based, and what's the balance? And what are some of the discussions and decisions around that, right? And so to what extent, as we're developing policies, financial aid policies specifically, to really think about perhaps how to be supportive of students, how do we provide some additional resources for students who come to our institutions with need? What does that look like? What are those discussions like? And to what extent for our first generation students, are we able to have discussions in language that if the student is a first generation student, we're thinking about it in the terms of that for some students, this is all new, right? And so
Right.
Understanding and reviewing the jargon and how those messages are sent to students, recognizing that for some first generation students, this is all new. And so not to take for granted that everyone will understand all the language, especially around financial aid, and really being thoughtful about how things are framed, almost looking at it from the lens of a first generation student to say, if I'm a first generation student and this is all foreign to me, how does this particular message read to me? And really taking back and really being so elemental that if I'm a first generation student, I'm not left out. I'm able to completely understand the entire process, and that there's some deliberate things done around that work pertaining to financial aid.
Good. Christy, anything to add?
I think Dr. Buster Williams covered that perfectly. The only thing I would add is that students, whether they're first gen or not, they really need to know that their learning is practical and immediately applicable and relevant to their experiences in the real world. And so it is incumbent upon the institutions to really take a hard look at both their student services, but also their curricula and their extracurriculars, and potentially reevaluate and retool in order to effectively serve this generation's of students' needs and desires as they pursue their dreams.
Thank you. In the decades that ended in the last century, colleges did a lot of things, and a lot of them were done just activities occurred that maybe weren't beneficial, but they just did things to do things. And if you recruited 1,000 students and 200 of them didn't come back, you just got 200 new ones. And we've learned in the last, particularly 10 or 15 years, and certainly COVID, it didn't help much, but one thing it helped, I think colleges in particular, is to recognize the importance of strategic planning. And so as you all have, each of you have said these words in effect, you have to be deliberate. Colleges have to be intentional. You can't just do things. You need to do the right things for the right reasons in order to build a relationship with students so they understand it's not a course I'm taking. I'm in a program that's going to enhance my life personally and professionally, and I need to complete the program. So thank you all so much. Ms. Roms, do you have any questions that we need to address? I know we're running out of time.
I don't. Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Buster Williams, for grabbing that question out of the chat. That was just really enjoyable. It was great to hear from all three of you.
Thank you so much. My thanks to my colleagues, Dr. Williams, and to soon to be Dr. Mathews. And God bless you all. Thank you so much. And so glad you were able to attend today. Blessings to each of you.
Bye.
Thank you.
so
Bye.
much. Thank you.
Yeah.